1 Samuel chapter 4, starting in verse 1, it says, "And the word of the Lord," just kidding, "and the word of Samuel," just rolls off the tongue so easy. "And the word of Samuel came to all Israel. Now Israel went out to battle against the Philistines and encamped beside Ebenezer, and the Philistines encamped in Aphek. Then the Philistines put themselves in battle array against Israel, and when they joined battle, Israel was defeated by the Philistines, who killed about 4,000 men of the army in the field. And when the people had come into the camp, the elders of Israel said, 'Why has the Lord defeated us today before the Philistines? Let us bring the ark of the covenant of the Lord from Shiloh to us, that when it comes among us, it may save us from the hand of our enemies.' So the people sent to Shiloh, that they might bring from there the ark of the covenant of the Lord of hosts, who dwells between the cherubim. And the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were there with the ark of the covenant of God. And when the ark of the covenant of the Lord came into the camp, all Israel shouted so loudly that the earth shook. Now when the Philistines heard the noise of the shout, they said, 'What does the sound of this great shout in the camp of the Hebrews mean?' Then they understood that the ark of the Lord had come into the camp. So the Philistines were afraid, for they said, 'God has come into the camp.' And they said, 'Woe to us, for such a thing has never happened before. Woe to us! Who will deliver us from the hand of these mighty gods? These are the gods who struck the Egyptians with all the plagues in the wilderness. Be strong and conduct yourselves like men, you Philistines, that you do not become servants of the Hebrews, as they have been to you. Conduct yourselves like men and fight.' So the Philistines fought, and Israel was defeated, and every man fled to his tent. There was a very great slaughter, and there fell of Israel 30,000 foot soldiers. Also, the ark of God was captured, and the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, died. Then a man of Benjamin ran from the battle line the same day and came to Shiloh with his clothes torn and dirt on his head. Now, when he came, there was Eli sitting on his seat by the wayside watching, for his heart trembled for the ark of God. And when the man came into the city and told it, all the city cried out. When Eli heard the noise of the outcry, he said, 'What does the sound of this tumult mean?' And the man came quickly and told Eli. Eli was 98 years old, and his eyes were so dim that he could not see. Then the man said to Eli, 'I am he who came from the battle, and I fled today from the battle line.' And he said, 'What happened, my son?' So the messenger answered and said, 'Israel has fled before the Philistines, and there has been a great slaughter among the people. Also your two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, are dead, and the ark of God has been captured.' Then it happened, when he made mention of the ark of God, that Eli fell off the seat backwards by the side of the gate, and his neck was broken, and he died. And for the man was old and heavy, and he had judged Israel 40 years. Now his daughter-in-law, Phinehas' wife, was with child due to be delivered, and when she heard the news that the ark of God was captured, that her father-in-law and her husband were dead, she bowed herself and gave birth, for her labor pains came upon her. And about the time of her death, the women who stood by her said to her, 'Do not fear, for you have borne a son.' But she did not answer, nor did she regard it. Then she named the child Ichabod, saying, 'The glory has departed from Israel, because the ark of God had been captured, and because of her father-in-law and her husband.' Then she said, 'The glory has departed from Israel, for the ark of God has been captured.'" You guys can grab a seat. Man, don't you guys just love the Old Testament? Like, honestly, anyone who says the Bible is boring just has not actually read it. It's there's a lot of drama, there's a lot of intrigue, there's a lot of twists and turns. There's some romance, there's a lot of violence, and there's all truth. And I love the Old Testament because one, it points to our salvation, right? The entirety of the Old Testament points to Jesus Christ. And we know this because Jesus even himself says this when on the road to Emmaus, when he expounded on the scriptures from the prophets to them about all the things concerning him. And so we know, from Genesis to beginning of Matthew, that the entirety of the Old Testament is about Jesus. And as we read some of these things, we're like, well, how does Jesus fit into this? Well, everything is a precursor, a symbol, or it's building up to Jesus coming through the Hebrews. And as we get into chapter 4, we've already gone through some drama in chapters 1 through 3. We saw in chapter 1, remember Hannah, she couldn't have kids. She was devastated about it. The Bible says in chapter 1 that she was in the bitterness of her soul, she prayed to the Lord and wept in anguish. So we see vividly just the expressions and the emotions that she had as she was going through this. Obviously, um, her husband's other wife was making fun of her for it and all these things and being an antagonist. And she brings these prayers to the Lord, and God answers them through a son named Samuel. You guys remember this? And Samuel, as she's been given to him, makes a vow to God that he, Samuel, is going to serve the Lord or serve under the Lord his whole life. And so he takes on um, the Nazirite vow. And so he's given to Eli to bring up as a priest. During that time, we see Eli's two sons, Hophni and Phinehas. They're revealed to be very corrupt priests, right? They dishonored the Lord, even in the midst of the tabernacle, where it should have been holy and sacred. But then there's the contrast again of Samuel, who is faithful, who is God honoring, God fearing, and the people actually love him. Well, then we get into chapter 3. If you remember this from last week, or 2 weeks ago, God eventually speaks again after not speaking for a while. And the first time he speaks to Samuel in the middle of the night, and Samuel doesn't know who's speaking to him. Remember this, 3 times he calls his name. And the first 2 times, Samuel had no idea, and he thought it was Eli. By the end of the second time, Eli's like, hey, it's the Lord. He's speaking to you. Say, here, Lord, here I am. And eventually he answers, and God speaks to him. Samuel listens, and God prophetically delivers a message of judgment against Eli and the priesthood of his household. And so that chapter ends with Samuel being recognized throughout Israel, if you see in verse 20 and 21, as the true prophet of God, and that God again is speaking. And this time, when he's speaking through Samuel. And that's where we get into verse 1, where it says, the word of the Lord came to all, or the word of Israel came to all. The word of Samuel came to all Israel, right? The word of Samuel came to all Israel. But speaking that God was the one speaking through Samuel to Israel, he is the spokesperson for God. It wasn't just Samuel and his thoughts and his opinion speaking, it was God speaking to him. Now, this is the last time in this chapter that we're going to even see the mention of Samuel. He's only mentioned here in verse 1, and there's a significance to this because there's going to be a shifting of our focus now to Israel and their military conquests or their lack of conquests and the spiritual crisis within Israel. So Samuel's listening to the Lord, but Israel still is not. And when I say Israel, obviously I'm talking about the nation of Israel, the encompassing nation, is not listening to the word of the Lord, even though it's now been readily made available to them through Samuel. So before God wasn't speaking, obviously they wouldn't hear the word of God. Well, now God is speaking, and they still wouldn't hear the word of God because they don't want to listen, right? And that's bad. That can be us. We can find ourselves in that place when we show up to church or in whatever capacity, and the Lord can be speaking, and yet we're not listening. And I'm not saying that to like make you guys feel bad for whatever dropped over there. Like, I'm not talking about like listening, like I hear what you're saying, but actually, like, am I allowing the Lord to speak? You know what I mean? Like, not, I know you hear what I'm saying right now, and I know you read the word of God, but are we truly listening? In the same sense, we talked about 2 weeks ago when God speaks, sometimes he speaks in a still small voice like he did to Elijah or Elisha. Can't remember which one, right? And the point is so that you can be intentional in hearing what he is saying to you because he's going to speak differently to each one of us, right? We all have different issues. We all have different sins. We all have different circumstances that we're going through. And so he's going to speak to us individually, and we need to listen to what he is saying. But even though it's been made available, they're still not listening. And so they have the availability of God's word, but just because there's the availability doesn't mean they're listening, but also doesn't mean that there's going to be obedience. And we see this in this chapter where there's a lack of obedience. They had access to his word, but yet they still chose their own way. And so here they get into problems with the Philistines. The problem with the Philistines has been going back all the way since the time of Abraham. In Genesis chapter 26, when Abraham's servants actually, they dug some wells, and the Philistines came behind and filled them up with dirt. This is how it all started. This was the extent of their problems. Obviously, it's expanded into what we see now here in chapter 4 of First Samuel, where they're going to go to battle and fight against each other, and thousands of Israelites are going to die. But they're their enemy. Their constant enemy during this time. And the Philistines weren't some simple, easy enemy that could be a pushover. No, they had military strength, they had technological advancement. Um, they were a hard enemy to go against. And actually, let me say it like this too: it didn't matter who they were fighting. They could have fought, 100 little girls, and they still could have lost 30,000 men. Why is that? Huh? Close. It has to do with that. And we're going to talk about it as we get through this, because they start this initial fight, they lose 4,000. And they're like, "Well, dude, what are we doing? We don't have the Ark of the Covenant with us. We don't have the Ark of God with us. Let's go grab it and bring it into the battle with us." Well, they went from losing 4,000 to how many? 30,000. And the ark of God was where God would meet his people, right? It's in a sense where God would, like, in a sense, manifest himself, where he would sit on the mercy seat and be able to speak to his people, where he and his glory could be revealed. And yet they still lost. So it wasn't so much that the Philistines were like the greatest warriors and that they had the ultimate and best military. Now they did have a good military, but that's not the real reason why they lost and why they lost so many. It was their lack of obedience and reverence to who God was. And that's why I could say that they could have lost a battle against 100 little girls, because if God wasn't with them, well, then they weren't going to win. And if it was God's will to bring upon that judgment because of their lack of obedience, well, then the same outcome would have still happened. But all that to say that the Philistines were a constant enemy to them. They were a constant enemy to them. And so again, verse 1, as we continue, it says, "Now Israel went out to battle against the Philistines." And what they do, they encamped beside Ebenezer. Do you guys know what Ebenezer means? I mean, we think of Stooge. What's his name? Scrooge? I said Stooge. Scrooge. I think of the song, "I Raise My Ebenezer." Here, I raise my Ebenezer. What song is that? It's a worship song. You guys know what song we're talking about? Then you're like, "Why am I raising my Ebenezer?" You ever thought that? Am I the only one? So you guys are singing worship songs and you know exactly what you're saying? That's good. Ebenezer means stone of help. Stone of help. And there's actually another incident, and we're going to see this in chapter 7, where after they actually end up having victory over the Philistines, that Samuel then is going to raise up a stone, and he's going to call it Ebenezer, right? And so that's why when we get to that song where it says, I raise my Ebenezer," it's in reference to chapter 7. We'll get to that in a while, but that's the reference here. Um, and so we see that in chapter 7. We see it here in chapter 4 where they camped beside Ebenezer. I believe it's two different locations because it's described differently. But here we see that it's named Ebenezer, and then the reason I think we see in chapter 7 that Samuel names a different spot Ebenezer is because he kind of wants to reverse what had happened. So in the previous one, they lost so many. In the second one, there was a bunch of victory. And so he changes the name. And so in verse 2, it says, "And the Philistines put themselves in battle array against Israel. And when they joined battle, Israel was defeated by the Philistines, who killed about 4,000 men of the army in the field." This is the first of a few defeats that we're going to see in this chapter. And this is significant because, again, this is God's chosen people. And here they're losing. They're losing battles, but they're losing a lot of people. And again, like I was saying previously, with whoever they fought, they would have lost, because this wasn't so much a military defeat as it was theological. In the sense, I think that it was showing God's presence was not with Israel, right? Despite them being God's people. And then also despite them being God's people with God's ark, right? So it's a theological defeat. It's not a military. It's not like they weren't prepared. They weren't skilled enough in their fighting and their combat. No, this is what God has judged and God has decided because God was not with them in this. This is so vastly important for us that if God is not in it, then we can easily be defeated or deceived. If God is not leading, if God is not the one guiding, if God is not in the midst of it, if God is not present, then what are we doing? Right? In my own strength, I can absolutely accomplish nothing. Right? And this is why the Bible tells us that it's not by spirit, nor or it's not by might, not by power, but it's by my spirit, says the Lord of hosts. Right? So for you to accomplish anything, it has to be done by the Spirit of God because that's where the power comes. It's not by your own wisdom, your own giftings, your own skills, your own military might. No, this was a theological defeat. So in verse 3, it says, when the people had come into the camp, right, they lost 4,000. The elders of Israel said, why has the Lord defeated us today before the Philistines? It's like, we're God's chosen people. How could we lose anything that we do? For us, we could say, well, I'm God's child. Why do I have to go through any hardship? Why do bad things happen? That's essentially what they're saying. Why has the Lord defeated us today before the Philistines? And they say this. They come up with a plan. Let us bring the ark of the covenant of the Lord from Shiloh to us, that when it comes among us, it may save us from the hand of our enemies. And so they ask a really great question. Why has this happened? Why has the Lord allowed this defeat to happen today? So they ask a great question. Should have been the question they asked before they even went into battle. Because here, afterwards, they recognize the sovereignty of God. They recognize, it's not, well, why did our captain allow this to happen? Like, he didn't lead well enough. No, they recognize the sovereignty of God, that it was his choice for this outcome, that he allowed or even caused their defeat. But here's the thing, is they ask a great question, but they jump to the wrong solution. They jump straight to the wrong solution. And their solution here is to not wait for the Lord to speak, but to come up with their own man-made idea, to do what they think is powerful in their own might. And they're like, oh, let's go get the Ark of the Covenant, right? Let's bring that into battle. Was that necessarily a wrong thing to do? Not necessarily, because it's been done before. We saw it when the Israelites went to war against Midian in the book of Numbers. Obviously, we haven't read that, but Numbers chapter 31, verses 6 and 7 says, Moses sent them 1,000 from each tribe to war, and Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the priest, to the war with them, and the holy vessels and the trumpets for the alarm in his hand. So they made war against Midian, just as the Lord had commanded Moses, and they killed every male. We see it when they walked around Jericho. They did the same thing where they brought the ark of the Lord before them and walked with them. This isn't going to be the last time that the Ark of the Covenant is brought into battle. We're going to see it in chapter 14 of this book. We're going to see that time there's actually going to be victory. So it's not a matter of the fact that the ark is or isn't there. I think it's why it is or isn't there, right? And for this time, specifically in chapter 4, the reason that they bring it into battle is because they're treating it like it's some magical genie lamp, right? Like it's some, rabbit's foot. It's some, uh, what's the word I'm trying to look for? Yes, a lucky charm. That's exactly what I was trying to think of. Like it's a lucky charm, right? Oh, we have this, we're going to win, right? They're superstitious. That's what's happening here. And they think because they have it that they're going to win. And so again, what does they say in verse 3? It says, let us bring the ark of the covenant of the Lord from Shiloh to us, that when it comes among us, it may save us from the hand of the enemies. The wording here is so important. Look closely. It says it, or rather, I should say, they say it, that when it comes among us, it will do what? May save us from the hand of the enemies. Now, I'll ask the question, how many times do we do that? Where we reduce the presence of God to a thing and not a person? Where we hold a superstition or some type of religious ceremony, tradition, whatever it may be, more important than the person of God. It's so important for us to remember this, that God is not ours. We are His, right? We are His. God is not here to serve us, we're here to serve Him. We shouldn't be saying, what can God do for me? But what can I do for God? It's not our will, but whose will? God's will, right? Paul says it really well, Romans chapter 12, 1 and 2. I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, to do what? Present your bodies a living and holy sacrifice, acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service of worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that the will of God is good, perfect, and acceptable. We're His. And so we can't treat Him like He's some lucky charm. We can't treat, an object or a thing like some superstition. The importance is God and His presence. You guys ever seen Indiana Jones? You guys have not seen Indiana Jones? The one with Raiders of the Lost Ark? Oh, dude, if you haven't seen it, watch it. If it's bad when you watch it, just pretend like I didn't recommend it because I don't remember every single detail in that movie. But Raiders of the Lost Ark, they kind of had that same idea where the Ark had it was some powerful weapon that they could use. The Nazis thought they could use it in some type of way, and obviously it in the movie it does. Like I think don't they like open it up and they all like die or something? Yeah, yeah, it's pretty gnarly. I think if I remember correctly. Um, Now, in a sense, like there had to be a reverence for the Ark of God, and I can't get into the details of this because there was a time where a guy accidentally stumbled. I don't know if you remember this. He stumbles and he catches himself on the Ark and he, he drops dead because he touched it because he wasn't supposed to touch it because the Ark of the Covenant was holy, which is why they had the poles to begin with. It's the whole thing. But the point is, we can't trade something that is holy and make it superstitious. If something's holy, it's holy because it's God and His presence. And we can't use God again like He's some magic 8 ball or a genie. And that's what's happening here, right? What again, if we look closely, we see that they say it. That this thing, this object is going to save us and not He, Him. Speaking of God, we know that's God who's going to do the saving. And so in verse 4, it says, the people sent to Shiloh that they might bring from there the ark of the covenant of the Lord of hosts, who dwells between the cherubim. And the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were there with the ark of the covenant of God. So they sent to where the ark is. Obviously, it's in Shiloh. That's the central place of worship. We know this from chapters 2 and 3. They're desperate. They say, hey, let's bring this into battle. Bring this ark of the covenant of the Lord of hosts. And here, the author says, who dwells between the cherubim. Now, if you remember how the ark was built, that there were two cherubim, which are angels, they face each other, which was over the mercy seat. And the mercy seat is where God, in a sense, would manifest Himself, where He would speak to His people. And there's a lot of significance to that, that not just speaks of that time, but of what is prophetically to come as well. And it says that the two people that escorted the ark were who? Hophni and Phinehas. Perfect guys for the job, right? Let's put the most holy guys on the job. No, these guys were immoral, irreverent. They dishonored God, and more so speaking because of their priestly roles. So they escort the ark, right? And that is a red flag already. Immediately, we should have known something is wrong. Something is spiritually wrong. One, they call for the ark. Two, look who's escorting it. And when the ark of the covenant of the Lord came into the camp, all Israel shouted so loudly that the earth shook. So they were stoked, right? They were enthusiastic. And this wasn't like some fake thing, this was real. They had faith, they believed. But guess what that faith and that belief was placed? It was misplaced on something, on an object rather than on the person. So here's this emotional hype, like, and we're gonna see in the next verses how loud they were, that it was something completely different than anyone has ever heard before. But here's this emotional hype, but we have to remember this: emotional hype is not the same as spiritual power. We have to remember that. Remember, they get excited. Sometimes people think excitement equals God's presence. And we see that in churches sometimes. We see that in different circles with different people where excitement we think has to do with God's presence, but the real test is obedience. And it's not to say that we can't be excited. We should be excited, right? But just because someone is dancing like they don't care doesn't always equate to God and his presence. The true test is obedience. Because it's easy to cheer for God, it's harder to actually walk with God. Now, when the Philistines heard the noise of the shout, right, because they were so enthusiastic, the whole earth shook. They said, "What does the sound of this great shout in the camp of the Hebrews mean?" Then they understood that the ark of the Lord had come in to the camp. This went way beyond their own camp. Like the Philistines heard this enough to the point where they were like, "What the heck was that?" And I would be like, I. It's kind of like you guys play sports? You ever been in a situation where you're winning or you won, and then at some point the other team is like happy and cheering, and you're like, dude, you lost. Like, what are you doing? This is what's happening here. Like they just went to battle and lost. Remember, 4,000 men died, and now they're shouting in excitement, and the Philistines are like, what the heck, dude? Like this is odd. What is happening here? This is like really really unusual. This is not some typical battle noise. Well, something must have happened, right? So they start to question, what does this mean? What is the reason behind this coming from the camp of the Hebrews? They're caught off guard, right? Again, they just won. Now they're cheering like they won. And they're like, did we not just win? I'd be so confused. Well, what they find out? That the ark of the Lord had come into the camp. They figured it out. In some way or the other, I don't know if they sent a spy in, they just found out that the ark was now in the hands of the Israelites. And the Philistines knew about the fame of God. And they knew about the stories of the ark of God and what had provided for the Israelites. They heard and they knew about the splitting of the Red Sea. They knew and heard about Egypt and its plagues. They heard about all the victories and everything that God had provided for Israel. And we're going to see that it's going to terrify them. So in verse 7, it says, the Philistines were afraid, for they said, God has come into the camp. And they said, woe to us, for such a thing has never happened before. A real reaction of fear. All right, they're not just doubting, they're panicking. All of a sudden, they went from being completely victorious. Nothing had changed. No one had died on their side. But now they found out the ark of God was in Israel's hands. And it's interesting enough because they didn't believe in this God, but yet they still knew the fame and the power of this God, right? And they were fearful. They understood the spiritual weight that the ark held. And they say here, God has come into the camp. It's interesting, and I think God does this for a reason. The Israelites treated it like it was a magical object, right? The Philistines were the opposite. They didn't say, oh, well, this object came into camp. They said, God has come into this camp. And so the Philistines, in a sense, have a higher sense of awe or respect for God and his presence and his power than the Israelites even do in this moment. And sometimes it is the pagans who put the Christians to shame and provide that correction. Very similar to Abraham when he lied about his wife being his sister. You remember that? And then the king, I forget his name, and he completely corrected Abraham and being like, dude, like I almost died because of you. Right? And the king had showed honor to God by not touching her. But sometimes it's the pagans who correct us, and we see this here. And they said, woe to us, for such a thing has never happened before. It's just a cry of, hey, we're done. They say again, woe to us. Who would deliver us from the hand of these mighty gods? These are the gods who struck the Egyptians with all the plagues in the wilderness. They maybe got their like where it happened mixed up. Obviously, it wasn't the wilderness that these plagues came about. It was in Egypt. But the point still stands. They knew the power of God. They heard the stories. They get it wrong too in the sense that they call God gods, right? So they misunderstand God, Israel's God, or their theology. They had a polytheistic view of things, right? Because they had many gods. A lot of these nations had many gods, where Israel was monotheistic, where they served and only had one true living God. And so what do? What do you do if you don't have God on your side? What's the best thing you can do to try and provide victory and try to pump your boys up? What do? You give the best speech you can give, right? The emotional hype to get ready. If you guys have ever played sports, if you've ever seen a movie with sports, or, oh my gosh, you ever seen, oh, I can't say that. It's a rated R movie, but sorry, it's a good movie. I'll say it, forgive me, Braveheart. Oh, wow, okay, so all of you have seen it. So shame on you, because I actually can see it because I'm over 17. Point being is, if you like in those movies, there's always like that great epic speech, right? And you just like want to run through a wall, and you're like, I don't care if I'm the first person in line. I'm gonna go run and fight. Well, that's the best they can do here, right? Is just some epic speech. And I'll be honest, it's a pretty awesome speech here in verse 9. I'd be hyped up. I don't know if I'd try to be the first in line, but they say, be strong and conduct yourselves like men. He's basically saying, act like a man, you Philistines, that you do not become servants of the Hebrews, that as they have been to you, conduct yourselves like men and fight. So there's this rally cry, right? There's a motivation here, but there's also a threat, right? We have the upper hand, let's not lose it. But also, we're not just fighting for survival, but we want to maintain dominance and also avoid humiliation by becoming what they are to us, which is servants. Don't let this happen. Conduct yourselves like men. 1 Corinthians 6:13 almost says the same thing. It says, watch, stand fast in the faith, quit yourself like a man, be strong. Right? Be strong. But the most important thing that we as Christians, even Christian men, that we find out, it's not so much about how much I can bench and how much I can squat, which are not bad things because we want to be healthy, but there's something that surpasses human strength. And Paul says this in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 10. He says, finally, my brethren, be strong in the Lord and the power of his might. Remember, your strength is nothing but weakness to God. It is nothing. But you can be strong, and it doesn't matter how much you can bench or squat. And you can be strong in the Lord and the power of his might. So where we find our failures and our failings by being strong in our own strength instead of learning to depend on God for his strength, that's where true strength comes from. Let's try to get to verse 11. So the Philistines fought, and Israel was defeated, and every man fled to his tent. And there was a very great slaughter, and there fell on of Israel 30,000 foot soldiers. So here's the Philistines. They're freaking out. They're like, this has never happened to us before. They have God with them. Let me give this epic speech just to see, like, hey, anything can happen. Well, guess what? They go to fight and 30,000 die rather than the 4,000 to begin with. Imagine the contrast here, where Israel thinks that they've got this in the bag. They brought the Ark of Covenant with them, but they lose, but they don't just lose, they lose badly. And here is this theological turning point happening right here in this verse. This is so important for us. Israel's superstition here is exposed because they were treating God like a lucky charm. And guess what? Not only did it fail, but God made them fail so epically that it was obvious that they were treating God the wrong way. I know it's easy to make fun of the Israelites and what they're doing here in this moment because we're reading through it and we can look back. But again, where do we fall in line with this, and how do we use God in the same way? You know, like he's some superstition or some genie. Do we desire God's presence more than, the things that he can provide us? Moses was a good example of that. So what happens? 30,000 die, and every man fled to his tent. This is just a complete and total defeat. They didn't retreat organized, they just panicked and they fled. So again, they go from 4,000 dying to 30,000 dying. And here's something to reflect on: God's presence is not automatic favor. God's presence should be accompanied with our obedience and our reverence. And so, yeah, they're like, hey, we have his presence with us. We're going to win. Well, no, there was a lack of obedience. There was a lack of reverence in the midst of that. And remember, they didn't even ask the Lord to begin with. There was no leading of God in the midst of this. So they had this religion, right? Here's this religion or former religion with the ark, and no faith, no submission. This is what God wants. God desires obedience rather than sacrifice, right? Here we could say, well, this is the sacrifice that they're making, but there's no obedience. God desires obedience over sacrifice. And God allows this because God is judging them, God is revealing to them, and God is desiring for them to wake up and see, hey, this is not what I desire. This is not how it goes. And in verse 11, we'll close here. Also, what happens? The ark of God was captured. And again, that's a huge turning point. And we're going to see, as we already read, that multiple people are going to die just upon the hearing that the ark of the covenant has been captured. And what else happens? The two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, they also die. They died. So the Ark of the Covenant leaving is a huge deal because this is, again, what the people knew, where God's presence came down. God was specific, and this is where he was going to come and bring his presence. And for the Ark of the Covenant to be taken out of Israel is a symbolization that God now has removed his glory from that nation, right? He's removed his presence from that nation. And that is a big deal. And then we have the two sons die, which was prophesied back in chapter 2, verse 34. It says, this shall be a sign to you that will come upon your two sons, as the man of God was speaking to Eli, on Hophni and Phinehas, and one day they shall die, both of them. And so the prophetic word of the man of God comes to pass two chapters later, and they both die. And then we're going to see, when we meet again next time, the death of Eli. Obviously, he's old, he snaps his neck, he's fat. And the interesting thing is, and we'll talk about this a little bit, is that he does not die when he hears about his two sons. When does he fall over? When he hears about the Ark of the Covenant being captured. That's when he falls over. That's when he's shocked. That's when he falls and he dies. And there's a significance to that because we've kind of, I won't say we've been bashing Eli, but he obviously messed up and he has to receive his judgment for that. But even the end of his life, he was still reverential towards the Lord.